away, and it will disappear. It's like one patient said, I was seeing this like I was seeing a television screen, and then when you asked me if I was seeing anything, the screen disappeared. And the minute you stopped asking me, the screen came back. So it was a very clear message. Don't interrupt the transmission. Don't create static. Don't intervene. Let this go on by itself. And for the greater part, that is true. If you let it go on, they will tell you the whole story afterwards. But otherwise, their defenses are such that they immediately begin to lose contact with it, as opposed to non-alexithymic individuals who can do this and describe it simultaneously. But here again, I think we have the important difference. People who more typically describe, as Dr. Markuson has described in some of his cases, the reliving, the abreactive experiences, they do so because they fuse both hemispheric levels, and they can move from one to the other quite naturally and easily. And normally, these people cannot, and therefore in the early stages of their being retrained, as it were, before they get both hemispheres to really function together, what's happening is they can use one, but they can't use the other at the same time. They have a one-channel system, and you can use one channel at a time, but only gradually do they get involved in using both. But they do get involved in using both. And 5, one of the most important consequences after perhaps 15 or 20 sessions of sensory hypnoanalysis is that their verbalizations become affective. They now begin to express feelings. Their inflections are there. Their attitudes are there. The emotion comes through. They yell, they scream, they say things in different tones of voice. It's not simply a verbal rendition. It has perceptual components, it has sensory components, it is freer, it is more spontaneous. And it in many ways resembles the free association of responses that patients in more classical analytic situations are taught to use. They now are expansive. And what's interesting as you observe their verbalizations, and in a few instances we have used polygraphic devices as I described yesterday with thoracic and abdominal measurements and GSR measurements, but in others you don't need that, because as they verbalize you can see their respiration changing. You can see the respiration getting rapid. You can see the face flushing. You can see the muscles tensing. You can see postural changes. In other words, the affect is now flooding into the system as they talk. It is no longer talking separated from feeling. It is now talking and feeling being simultaneously integrated. It is, not to use a term that sometimes has been related to simulation, but it is now an expressive theatrical dramatization of what's going on. It's very expressive, and it has affect more so than words. And whereas before their speech was very clear and sharp and articulate, as they begin to have more emotion in their speech, the speech becomes less articulate. It becomes less grammatical. It becomes less well organized, which is fine. But they begin to stutter every once in a while because now the emotions are flooding in and coming in very, very rapidly. All right, may we have the next slide, please? This is a summary of the psychodynamic activity that represents what took place in the sensory hypnoanalysis of these 54 patients. This is a summarization of what took place. First, a return from later acquisitions of representational capacity to earlier, more primitive systems of representation. For example, there was a retreat from words to images. In other words, they were doing in reverse what Ph.D. describes as the normal development in the mental functions of children, where one starts with images and moves to words. The pre-logical state is one in which children do not have access to much word. activity. They learn a few words early, but before the speech level, they have none. But they have images. Infants, newborn infants have images. The images are there. They can be recorded there. There was a retreat, as I say, from words to images. They became much more image-oriented. So this area, this other hemispheric area, was now becoming alive. It was beginning to function freely. It was no longer constricted. And it was sending messages back and forth. It was like two computers in a mainframe where they can talk to each other, rather than in a personal computer where it can't talk to anybody because it's only a one-channel computer. But it's a mainframe concept in which one can talk to the other. B, there was a return within one system to earlier contents. For example, there was a regression, generally, from a contemporary body image to a developmentally primitive body image. In other words, the chronological body image was one that was largely influenced by their defenses and by their resistances. A long time ago, Wilhelm Reich, in his character analysis, describes the armoring of the body as a defense against a hostile world, against an environmental world. Alexithymic patients have body armoring. They view their body as a weapon against the world. They use it posturally and otherwise. They use it aggressively, and they use it defensively. Now, they were describing, again from the content, from the tape recording contents, they were describing a body image which was a much more primitive body image. And I have to summarize some of this data for you because I couldn't bring some of the illustrative evidence. We asked them to make drawings, and the drawings that they made, the body image drawings, were much more primitive than the drawings which we got initially during the diagnostic period. Those drawings were very constricted, like house tree person drawings. You would have, for example, an image of the self when they were asked to draw a person. They would draw a person usually with a long neck in which the head was separated from the body by this very long detached head, and the arms were very rigid and stiff. Now, when they drew things, it looked like drawings of a child. They were fluid, they were loose, they were freer. They didn't have so much form, but they had expression. And interestingly enough, some of them, when they were asked to draw, would say, "Do you have crayons?" And when asked why, instead of just the pencil that they'd been given, they said, "Well, I'd like to draw it in color." And here again, there is a greater sense of contact with the primary body image, with the close body image that is less contaminated, that is less defensive, that has less been impaired by contact with the environment and with their relationships. See, there was a return within one system to earlier modes of organization, such as a shift from complex systems of associational rules to simpler rules of associational connection. For example, in some pathologic states, words may no longer be linked according to conceptual meaning, but rather by rhyming, by similarity, by association. They were engaging in associative activity. They were doing the kinds of things that children do during the early developmental ages. They were associating rhythmically and phonetically. They would pick up a word and they would repeat it. They would have associations to the phoneticism, not to the meaning of the word. Whereas before, these people were very literal. If you ask them, "How does that pain in your head feel?" they would try to give you an anatomical definition. Now, if you ask them how that pain feels, they might say, "Well, you know, it feels like there's a little demon in there that has all kinds of knives, and they're poking around, and they're cutting, and they're doing all kinds of things, and they're shredding parts of my head." And it would be this primitive, emotional, illustrative expression. It would come out in their drawings as well. It would come out in their dreams. But I think you can see what the summarization of this refers to, in that it is, again, a use of earlier developmental means to express coherent, logical, articulate ideas, but not constricted and not delimited the way it had been before. Finally, there was a shift to primitive levels of control and regulation. For example, instinctual drives were frequently expressed in primitive rather than more advanced or differentiated forms. Or there may have been a loss of distinction between internal and external images. As you know, in concepts of object relations and human relations and the normal development of the ego, the distinction between internal perceptions and external perceptions are frequently lost. And that's what gives rise to the primary process in regressive modes of behavior. In the process of projective identification, which Milton Kline has so well advanced, the boundary lines for the infant between the internal perception and the external attachments are blurred, and they tend to fuse and move over, so that in terms that are not necessarily Kleinian, there is a symbiotic relationship between the infant and the mother, both on a physiologic and now on an ego basis. And this projective identification is what, as we were talking about it yesterday, very much an important part of the hypnotic relationship. That the regressive element, without it having regressiveness in relation to chronology or to specificity, is a regression to the use of projective identification. And in the projective identification, the individual now feels secure in letting go boundaries of perceptual reality, knowing that that perceptual reality is going to be taken care of by the extension of this ego involvement by the other person to whom they're attached. And in the therapeutic relationship, they now are willing to ascribe and, in a sense, delegate certain adult ego functions while they can now attend to the more internalized ones. And they don't have to be vigilant about what is internal and what is external. You know, if I'm aware of certain feelings or ideas, I have to at least exercise a normal amount of vigilance before I speak it into a microphone. Or I might say some things that would offend you or upset you. I monitor what I feel, so that, for example, I don't respond to the initial things that I feel. As I'm talking about the fact that there is a movement towards projective identification as part of this therapeutic process, and then suddenly I have a personal association, I have to go to the bathroom. I don't say after that, I have to go to the bathroom. I will monitor or defer that association. They do not do that in the process. In other words, as they're now responding, as before they were monitoring with great vigilance, now they are permitting anything to come up, even if it seems in the context of adult reality perception to be unacceptable. They now say whatever they feel, and the language becomes much more primitive. May lose a little in translation here. For example, we show them some Rorschach cards in the regress state. Now, when you show somebody, most of you are familiar with Rorschach cards. So you see plate 1, typical popular response is, it looks like a bat. In this regressed projective identification reemergence, and this is just one illustration, it takes on a whole range of individuality and creativity because it is now an open system. I remember one patient looking at the card who before had said, that doesn't look like a bat, I'm at that. He said, this is a bat. In other words, the literalness of the lexiconic is not, as most patients in looking at card 1, that reminds me of a bat, or it looks like a flying bird, or it looks like a ballet dancer with a black dress on. There are a variety of relatively popular associations. But in the alexithymic patient, that is a bat. And when pressed a little harder, they'd say, well, how do you know it's a bat? It's a photograph of a bat. You can see that it's a bat. The literalness has to do with the associations that go on. Now, when I showed this plate under hypnosis and this advanced therapeutic stage to the same patient who had said, it is a bat, now the response was no longer a popular response. The response, and here you may have to translate or do it another way, because it's going to be a little difficult, because I'm using an American slang term, because that's what came out. It's a colloquialism. He looked at the plate and he said, "It sucks." He didn't give me an image. He was saying, try to think of other words that may be more consistent with your language. "It's terrible. I don't like it. It strikes a bad feeling in me. It creates a bad feeling." Nothing about its form or structure. In other words, he had retreated from form and structure, and he wasn't afraid to do this, because he was not afraid that he was going to lose control or appear to be crazy. It was okay. He could say whatever he wanted to say. But of course, this process of being literal and saying things which are well controlled limit one's perception. I can remember, and I'll digress a little bit at this point, many years ago, after World War II and the Nuremberg trials, Professor Gilbert, who had been the chief psychologist for the American government at the Nuremberg trials, and I mentioned some of this to Professor Zivny the other night, he had the responsibility for giving Rorschach tests to all of the Nazi war criminals as part of their diagnostic assessment. And one interesting bypart was that when he examined Hermann Goering, he said in his report that he felt that Goering suffered from an organic brain disease. The neurologist who did the examination clinically said there was no sign of it. But as some of you remember, Goering committed suicide by cyanide pill. And they did a post-mortem. They found a lesion in the parietal section of the brain, about the size of a good-sized peanut. So that these things do have some meaning, but that's not really the important story. After the war, Professor Gilbert was invited by the New York Academy of Medicine to give a presentation of his dynamic interpretation of the personalities of the major Nazi war criminals based on his Rorschach examinations. And these were all neurologists. These were not psychiatrists. This was for the Neurological Society of the City of New York, which was held at the New York Academy of Medicine. And at least in those days, neurologists knew nothing. They knew very little about psychiatry, but they knew less about Rorschach and psychodiagnostic procedures, and many of them had even heard about them. So what Gilbert did was to string up all of the Rorschach plates in front of the platform where the curtain had been. He hung them all, and he said, "This is the test that I administered, and these are the various plates. These, and the last three have color in them, and they have special significance." And he went on to describe the general concept of the Rorschach. And as he was about to begin his lecture, a rather somewhat elderly but well-known professor of neurology got up and said, "Professor Gilbert, before you begin, I've listened to everything you've said." And he said, "This is really nonsense." He says, "Any intelligent person can look at those Rorschach cards and tell you what they are. They're all photographs of female genitalia." So that here, the literalness precluded any real association of the content. He was so guarded and so defended that he refused to let any imaginative activity go on. The reverse takes place with our patients. They move from the literalness to now the expansiveness. So they look at a card, and instead of saying, "This looks like a ballet dancer," they say, "This looks like feces. This looks like shit. This looks like garbage." There is now a looseness. There is a total disengagement. And it is more significant of that freedom, that looseness of the pre-logical state that is so typical. And I think I've made some references to Piaget's work because I think it's very representative of what we see in hypnosis. I think we see different maturational and developmental levels of the ego, not just dynamically, not just in terms of the analytic concepts of the development of the ego, the superego, and the id, but we see the movement from pre-logical to logical formations and the use of those modes. And that as recently has been, as we were talking about neuroscience earlier, neuroscientific development in the area of cognitive work, the work of Alan Newell at Harvard and MIT, very interested in the neurophysiology of cognition, has made it very clear in a very recent publication in Science, just about 3 months ago, that the various modular components of the brain act in consort, of course, in the human normal brain, but in the normal human brain under different conditions, which Newell has described in a mathematical model, and which has been replicated in an anatomical model now by co-workers, it is possible for one module to be removed from its functioning entity and for the rest of the brain to operate without that module's input. In other words, you're getting different kinds of sensory inputs, and you're taking out some sensory inputs from time to time. And I think when we utilize hypnosis and hypnotic procedures, strategies, we're doing something which is very much like that. And that's why I say I think the developments in neuroscience are going to be very helpful to people who practice hypnotherapy, because they're going to tell us more about not how we're doing things, but what we're doing. Because we have been focusing on how we do things, but we're not in a position to know what we're doing because we can't crawl inside and we don't have that expertise and we don't have that instrumentation. But it is clear that various components can be moved and they can be detached as sensory inputs and they can be overloaded. And this produces distortions and changes in affect, in ideation, and in the dynamics of personality functioning, and in the dysfunctional human mechanism. And when I say the human mechanism, we're talking about the personality and the brain as well. We can refer to, as we do, the mentality of individuals and their minds and their feelings. We're also dealing with a brain stem and a brain that's attached to it. And I think I have found that Piaget's concepts become increasingly more meaningful as we examine aspects of regressive modes of behavior and the way the cognitive functions become linked up with various kinds of affects that are elucidated during the hypnosis. At any rate, that gives you a clear idea of what went on, how it went on, and what the changes were that we observed. If we could please have the next slide, I think we could move on to that one. I think we're running a little over time, but if it's all right, I'd like to finish the slides before we have a break. This is the image activity scale in waking and hypnosis for the 54 alexithymic patients. These were the things we inquired about on this is a scale we created. These are the things we inquired about, and these are their responses. These are the percentage of responses. Was the image deliberate? We asked the patient, was the image you just reported deliberate? In the waking state, the percentage of deliberate images was very low, as you can see. Only constituted 1.25 of any images. In the hypnosis, 40% were deliberate. In other words, they had control over the images. When asked to create an image, they had much greater ability to respond to that idea, to that creation, to that suggestion, to that communication. And I don't like to use the word suggestion because I think it's too loaded and has too much older implication. But they were able to do what they were asked to do, and they could do it freely, whereas before they could not. The second question was, is the image related to the stream of thought at the moment? That image was related to the stream of thought in only about 2% of the cases of the alexithymic patients in the waking state. In the hypnotic state, 60% of them were able to make the connection. We clearly have indication now of moving from one hemisphere to the other. Both hemispheres are now left and right functioning together, at least more so. 60% is a reasonably high percentage here. Then they were asked, that image you had, the image happened to occur. That was our way of asking, was it spontaneous? Did it come about because we asked you, or did it just pop into mind? Popping into mind, only 3% about. Popping into mind, spontaneity in the hypnotic state, 56%. The second really is the same aspect, and you see the percentages are close. One, it happened to occur. The other, they were aware that it popped into mind. A similar question, because you have to ask the question in many different ways. Did this image intrude into your mind?